Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. I'm here to interview one of my favorite New Thinking Aloud guests. That's me, myself. And today we're going to talk about space, time, and consciousness. It's really a profound question. It's one that's puzzled me for years and years, and I couldn't think of a better person to discuss it with. And the reason is this. As a parapsychologist, I've often been puzzled by the fact that extrasensory perception seems to defy all conventional scientific explanation, in the sense that there's no organ of perception, there's no means of transmission of information across space and time, and yet people seem to have knowledge of distant events and future events. So I'd often thought that space and time are not really what we assume them to be. Today, I think we can begin to probe that a little further. And let me begin by asking you, my guest, what do you think of space and time at this point? Interesting that you say at this point, because this is a point in space and time. You could say this is a point in the evolution of this particular biological organism having a conversation with itself about space and time. But of course, our topic is space, time, and consciousness. And I think it's fair to say, as has really been discussed on many New Thinking Aloud interviews, that space and time, all of space and time, to the very distant reaches of the universe, you might even say infinity. You might say infinity in terms of the past, infinity in terms of the future, infinity in terms of how far away in space we can go. All of that exists within consciousness. And by that, I mean within my personal consciousness. But let me be clear, I don't mean ego by personal, I mean self. And when I say self, I'm referring to it in kind of a Jungian sense, by which I mean, as my friend Bernardo Kastrup loves to quote Schopenhauer, the one eye that looks out through the eyes of every living creature. That is to say, the one consciousness that looks out through the eyes of every living creature. Well, since you have brought up the psychology of Carl Jung, it's probably worth mentioning that Jung speaks of the collective unconscious. And I think it's fair to say, even for myself, yourself, that when you talk about that one consciousness that encompasses the entire universe, it's rarely that at the personal level you're aware of it, because let's face it, you, like every other person, from day to day, you're concerned with practical concerns. When are you going to eat? What are you going to eat? What are you going to do today to earn a living? Of course, that's all true for me and for all of our viewers as well. Here we are dealing with our biological forms, and the biological form pretty much keeps us grounded within space and time. And in fact, it's such a tenacious illusion that we tend to think that space and time exists independently of our own consciousness. And in fact, for most of my life, I'd say it seemed pretty obvious to me that I measure space according to rulers and miles and airplane destinations, and I measure time in terms of what the clock tells me. All of these things are outside of myself. They're not part of my consciousness. And yet, isn't it the case that some of the great philosophers, perhaps Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest of all philosophers, made it very clear that these categories that seem so a priori before anything human, something that we see outside of ourselves, no, he said, these categories are the result of being conscious. How can that be, though? They seem so independent of each person. After all, when you look at the life of any given human being, you have a birthday, a date of birth, and a date of death, a date of marriage, a date of confirmation or bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. It seems as if the organism itself is defined by space and time. Yes, but if you look at physics itself, which is the study of the physical universe, everything in space and time, what does it boil down to? We have these particles, and they are so tiny and so distant from each other that it's mostly all vacuum. And yet it seems so solid to us. And yet also the physicists are telling us that at the quantum level, the time can easily be reversed. There's no necessity for time to flow only in one direction. All of that occurs at what we think of as the macro level. And the macro level is completely dependent upon the way we perceive it through our sensory organs. If it wasn't for these sensory organs, we might be traveling along at a beam, a light beam. Well, in fact, it was traveling on a light beam that was the thought experiment that Albert Einstein engaged in that led to his development of the theory of relativity. What would it be like to travel on a light beam? And it seems as if, in the example of Einstein, consciousness has that property. Consciousness can travel on a light beam. Einstein showed that. In fact, consciousness can do a great deal more than that. Look at all of the work in remote viewing. It's showing that it doesn't work perfectly yet. After all, we are still biological organisms. But in consciousness, people using remote viewing can travel to distant locations in time and space and come up with accurate descriptions of what they experience. And in consciousness, people can do many, many other things. There are yogis who can bilocate. There are a whole category of people who report out-of-body experiences. Many people have, and in particular, J.H.M. Whiteman, otherwise known as Michael Whiteman, has demonstrated over decades in great detail in his writings the ability to leave his body at will and travel across these other dimensions that we could consider part of the collective unconscious, perhaps, or perhaps, as my friend Ruth Kastner points out in the interview that was just released 2 days before this one will be released, into the area of possibility, quantum probabilities, the Schrödinger psi waves, the realm in which anything might happen. How fascinating that you bring up Schrödinger psi waves. I know many, many years ago in a book called, if I remember correctly, The Scientist Speculates, edited by I.J. Good. It's probably half a century old or more. And I think it was I.J. Good himself, the mathematician, who suggested that the psi of the Schrödinger psi waves and the psi of parapsychology were really the same psi. That is, that ability of the mind to access information from distant points in time and space is the equivalent of the probability waves of quantum mechanics. I think my friend Stuart Hameroff, when speaking about consciousness at the quantum level, refers to that level as quantum geometry. Ruth Kastner, in the recently released interview with her, talks about it as the realm of possibility. In fact, she says the reality of possibility. It's an ontologically real level, but it is not part of space-time. Actually, space-time emerges from it. And it's worth mentioning that our good friend Bernardo Kastrup, the brilliant philosopher, the champion of what he calls analytical idealism, the philosophy in alignment with Kant and Schopenhauer and Berkeley, that the universe itself is essentially mental in nature, that it's not just dead matter, it's consciousness, the one consciousness that sees through the eyes of every living creature. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the reality of possibility or the reality of probability. It's consciousness itself. And that consciousness has within it realms within realms within realms. The interesting thing is that these realms have been mapped out by consciousness explorers, by the ancient yogis, by people engaged in out-of-body experience, by modern meditators, by remote viewers, even by people such as Frederick Myers, the great psychical researcher who dictated, apparently, books from the afterlife about what that afterlife realm is all about, not to mention the explorations of psychologists such as Carl Jung using active imagination. It's as if there's a whole other continent, a continent of infinite possibilities, yet we can map it. What an exciting idea. Now, I know we've looked at that before. We've discussed it with, for example, Charles Tart, one of my dissertation committee members when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, who back in 1973 in Science magazine published an article called State-Specific Science. Can we go into altered states of consciousness and in those states begin to measure new aspects of reality that are only accessible to us when we're in those states? Well, as I recall from my recent discussions with Charlie Tart about that, he was rather pessimistic in the sense that he felt that any such exploration would always be conditioned by or clouded by or tainted by the sociological preconceptions of people. If you're a Buddhist, you're going into that exploration with a cosmology already in mind. If you're a Christian, you have a different cosmology already in mind. And so your exploration of these mental realms is going to be conditioned by your own mentality. And there's no getting around it. That indeed is a serious problem, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a problem that can't be overcome. It may take time. It may take another 100 years, but the point is that the problem has been recognized. How do we get outside of our own mentality when we are exploring realms of consciousness itself? Funny you should mention that. I recently came across an interesting book by a person I've known of for many years, Angela Brown Miller. She's a psychologist who works in the areas of addiction, but her book, it's a fascinating book, and I plan to have another conversation with her about it in the future. How to Die and Survive. And it is about letting go. It's about the process of letting go of everything to which you're attached, your identity, your sense of self, your mentality. And after you've let go of your mentality completely, you still are left with pure awareness. And it is from that state of pure awareness that you can begin to explore these realms, these subtle realms of consciousness. It's like a new continent. Imagine in the 1500s, in the 1400s even, the European explorers were just discovering the New World. We're in a similar position right now. We're just discovering the New World, but as Pogo says, we have met the enemy and it is us. It is certainly a challenging exploration. It's an exploration that would include, of course, the archetypes of the Jungian subconscious mind, the Freudian subconscious mind. It would include the Bardo planes that are referred to in Tibetan Buddhism, the realms of the afterlife. And Jung is quite clear that those realms, afterlife realms, are part of the collective unconscious. But beyond that, it would include realms that have been explored by pioneers such as Whitley Strieber, talking about the visitors, aliens who come to this planet from other locations, other dimensions perhaps in space, hyperspace perhaps from other planets. We know that there's a great deal of exploration going on there, and there's much to be said about the relationship between the visitors from other planets and other dimensions and the realm of the afterlife. We could have to assume, if we're talking about the one consciousness that sees through the eyes of all creatures, that includes many kinds of creatures beyond the vast variety we know of already, biological creatures of this earth, that there are even realms beyond that. So the exploration to be considered is just enormous, and really it is just beginning. There are certainly many obstacles, the biggest obstacle being obviously ourselves, our conditioning, our mentality. But let us begin. It's not as if we can't solve some of these problems. And I think that's a good note to end on. So let me thank you very much for interviewing me about this most vital of all topics. And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.